DJ Luman, DJ Lala, and
so this will get through, and then you'll hear a little short
Rhyme
Tom Hartman ID.
Saturday, April 15th. For more information, visit rhymefestla.com or kpfk.org.
This is KPFK 90.7 FM, Los Angeles.
KPFK Rebel Alliance News, Los Angeles.
In today's headlines, last-minute negotiations as a 3-day strike of school workers looms. California gas bill shock, mental health, how the state refuses to help with flooding in Pajora and Monterey County. Professor John Mersheimer on the Ukraine conflict. Most important meeting of China and Russia in a decade has started. The non-NATO international news. All this and more coming up. Good evening. My name is Sylvester Rivers.
And I am Bill Benton.
School district officials and union leaders were set to begin last-ditch negotiations this afternoon in hopes of preventing a scheduled 3-day strike that would shut down classes for more than 420,000 students beginning tomorrow morning, that according to School Board President Jackie Goldberg. I continue to be cautiously optimistic, Goldberg said. She continued, I've been on strike twice in my life. I don't think anybody wants to be on strike. So if there were any way not to be on strike, I'm sure both of our unions will try to find what that is. School district officials had tentatively scheduled a press conference for 4 p.m., but it's not clear whether they will report meaningful progress that would delay or halt the strike or give an update on preparations for a walkout. The next few hours could determine which it will be. Goldberg said both parties were waiting for an appointed mediator to arrive before beginning the negotiating session. The strike would be led by Local 99 of Service Employees Union International, whose members include custodians, bus drivers, teachers' aides, security aides, special education assistants, and food service workers. Joining in the strike would be members of the United Teachers Los Angeles, which includes teachers, nurses, therapists, counselors, and librarians. UTLA also is bargaining with the nation's second-largest school system. An immediate response from Local 99 was not available, but union officials have said that they remain committed to the bargaining process, although they intended to await the scheduling of an official fact-finding panel, a step that would not happen in advance of the timetable for the strike. Separately, Union Executive Director Max Arias had said he would return to negotiations immediately only if the union's wage demands were met. The union is asking for a 30% wage increase plus a $2 per hour additional raise for the lowest-paid workers. Local 99 members make an average of $25,000 annually. For a comparative comparison, many of them working part-time. Arias said he wants to raise that average to $36,000. In California, the poverty line is established at $36,900 for a family of 4.
Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
Southern California gas customers are rightfully outraged about high gas bills. That's this winter, as evidenced by online comments and calls to state legislators. The utility ominously warned customers to brace themselves for shockingly high bills, more than double what they paid in 2021, with some reaching over $900. Paying more for utility bills is not an option for some between Los Angeles, housing affordability crisis, and the growing cost of necessities. Low-income communities are already living on the brink. While gas prices volatility is expected in the winter, the current price spike seen on Southern California gas bills is cited by some as the worst in 30 years, causing customers to blame Southern California gas for price gouging, given that they saw the highest price spikes in California and other western states. Between January 2022 and 2023, the average PG&E customers saw their bills increase $44, while the average Southern California gas customer saw their bills increase $176. That according to NOC LA. Customers aren't alone in their mistrust of Southern California gas and high gas prices. Consumer watchdog petitioned State Attorney General Rob Bonta and L.A. City Attorney Heidi Feldstein Soto to investigate price gouging by Southern California Gas, a call echoed by L.A. advocates in similar letters to the city attorney. Consumer Watchdog said the utility mismanaged their gas storage supplies, leading to an unnecessary buying on the spot market, where wholesale gas is bought and sold for immediate delivery at high prices. They also questioned whether trading subsidiaries of Southern California Gas parent company, Sempra Energy, profited from the artificial inflation of the spot price. Following pressure from elected leaders, including the L.A. County Board of Supervisors and California State Senate Republicans, the California Public Utilities Commission, the agency responsible for regulating utilities, hosted a special hearing to discuss gas price spikes. During the meeting, Southern California Gas attributed the soaring price of wholesale methane gas to an atypically colder winter, increased demand, and storage issues. But Governor Gavin Newsom didn't buy these excuses and alluded to Southern California Gas being unable to account for the extent and longevity of this price spike. In a letter to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, a federal agency tasked with regulating the transmission and sale of gas and electricity between states, Newsom urged FERC to investigate California's energy market to determine whether manipulation, anti-competitive behavior, or the anomalous activities are driving these ongoing elevated prices in the Western gas markets. According to NOC LA, a quarter of low-income households in Los Angeles are severely energy burdened, spending 10% of their income on energy needs. Energy burdens disproportionately impact households and communities of color who are also located in the most populated areas of the city. NOC LA maintains that we need energy policies that correct past harms inflicted on our communities due to the legacy of environmental racism and fossil fuel pollution. Investing in long-term solutions centering energy justice and paving the way for affordability is key. The gas bills arriving in the mail this winter are hurting low-income families. There's no getting around it. These bills should serve as a wake-up call to move forward with utility debt relief that meets the scale of need. Renewable energy investment and all-electric home upgrade are feasible solutions that would transition households from fossil fuels that are the root cause of this affordability crisis. That according to NOC LA.
Can you hear the drumming? There's a revolution coming.
Governor Gavin Newsom is pursuing a statewide ballot initiative that would go before voters in 2024. According to Newsom, the initiative will modernize.
Man, the sound quality is great.
Substance use.
The sound quality from your live read and this pre-record basically are the same.
That's good.
The state faces. And that's the issue of
Oh, yeah, that's good.
and the supportive services that we need to be stacked on that housing to stabilize individuals that are in acute states of psychosis, people that are self-medicating with drug or alcohol addictions. We're fooling ourselves that if we don't address that fundamental need, that we can turn this thing around, that we can have the impact that we continue to promote. And that requires us to look at new strategies, new interventions. Most fundamental is setting aside consistently $1 billion+ to focus on that integration of housing as a key component. Number two, we will also be amending the Mental Health Services Act to allow for more focus as it relates to substance abuse. That was not originally envisioned with the original Mental Health Services Act. But number two, to let folks know we can turn this around. And what we are also advancing is a framework that I hope stretches the minds, the people of this state, that we can fix this, that we know how to do it. And so $1 billion a year, expanding the scope of what is included in terms of what was originally envisioned 20 years ago in the Mental Health Services Act is foundational in this effort. And so we look forward to working with the counties as we work out the details of this legislative package and move it forward with the voters in terms of reprioritizing. Number two, the big idea is now recognizing, continue to do what you've done, you'll get what you got, which is some very impressive success, but not at the scale of the challenge. More contemporary histories as it relates to deinstitutionalization, but this was not one single act that occurred. This was a series of acts that occurred over a course of many, many decades. I remember 1963, there was a Community Mental Health Act that was signed by then President Kennedy. And then there was a guy named Ronald Reagan, 1967, that with good intention and a bipartisan piece of legislation, LPS, Leonard-Petra Short Act, talked about this vision that was amplifying the vision of Kennedy as it relates to community-based alternatives and not coercing people against their will in large mental institutions. I remember a few years later, perhaps one of the most consequential decisions that we continue to be reminded of, and that was the O'Connor versus Donaldson decision, the Supreme Court decision in 1975 that said legally we can't hold people against their will simply because of their mental illness. There was a push from the left and the right as it relates to the institutionalization. But we failed in the application, in the implementation of strategies to fund it. Carter infamously promoted some good work. Then President Reagan came in and said, no, that's states' rights, and basically outsourced it, further exacerbating the conditions ultimately here today. My point is, at a certain point, we got to stop pointing fingers, and we start to need to look in the mirror and take some responsibility. We have agency. We can shape the future. Those are all interesting and stubborn facts, but here we have the opportunity to reimagine and to advance that original vision. And that's what this is about. That's why we want to provide a bond component so we can provide minimum of 6,000 new beds, 6,000 new placements across the spectrum.
That was Governor Newsom speaking at a press conference yesterday, announcing his plan to introduce a ballot initiative to direct funds to programs that will help solve homelessness as it relates to mental illness. Skeptics, however, feel there have been many programs created with minimal results. Meanwhile, local organizations have been creating their own solutions. Sierra Smith is the executive director of Open Paths Counseling Center, a nonprofit organization.
With our work, we work with people who are navigating mild to moderate mental health issues, such as the common ones that every human faces at some point in their life: depression, anxiety, trauma, lots of trauma, stress, relationship issues, things like that. This bill is really intended to impact those with much more significant issues, chronic, severe mental illness that would require psychiatric intervention, which is outside of our scope for the level that they're talking about. And as I understand it, what he's really looking at is proposing an influx of continuous funding to help house people with severe chronic mental illness who have been unhoused. The mental health crisis has been recognized nationally at this point. And so we're seeing federal money coming to the states, and then the states each figuring out how they're going to be able to distribute the money to the different entities in the counties and local areas. What he's doing is looking at the money that's been allocated and figuring out where it should go. And there's been a big push for the CalAIM initiative, which is really looking at creating an open door policy called No Wrong Door, meaning that there's multiple points of entry that somebody can enter the system to get housed and food and access to all the necessary resources instead of being funneled into one particular pathway, which often was more difficult for people to actually get care. And so in the initiative of trying to create a more expansive way of providing services for people who are most directly impacted, there needs to be for lack of a better way to put it, a loosening up of the historic bureaucracy that's been, shutting doors and creating barriers at every turn. And that's really what this is all seeking to rectify. For probably since, chronically since Reagan shut down a lot of the permanent institutions where folks used to be placed, with good reason at that time because of all of the issues that they had with lack of care, lack of oversight, so on and so forth. But in all of this time, we haven't found another way in which to replace that. And so what this does from the proposal that Newsom has put on the ballot is it's providing an opportunity to see housing as an intervention for mental health, which, having worked in this field for a while now, one of the things that I recognize is that if you did not have a mental illness before becoming unhoused, there's going to be trauma, which can often lead to pretty significant mental illness during the time that a person is unhoused. So looking at housing as a fundamental intervention for mental illness is critical, and hopefully this will be a game changer in one aspect of the mental health crisis that we're in. It'll help deal with parts of it. It won't solve all of it, but it'll help deal with parts of it.
According to Smith, mental health has been on the rise for quite some time. She says there are a number of reasons contributing to this factor.
The impact of COVID cannot be underestimated. And then when you're talking about serving historically marginalized communities, particularly communities of color who have often been underfunded and underinvested in, you're also looking at the intersection of systemic oppression that plays into that, the ways in which historical legacies of oppression impact mental health on an ongoing basis, that culminating with the fact that COVID has hit communities of color and particularly underfunded, under-resourced, lower income communities even more, who often were the people doing a lot of the frontline work. It's been huge. We're also seeing this in the children at a level that we've never seen before. And, one of the things that this bill of the money that's coming down that I spoke about is a big initiative coming down to fund child and youth mental health crisis. But yeah, we're seeing it across the board. Historically, when we would have wait lists, you'd see a ramp up in the early part of the year in the spring, and the wait list would get quite large. And then you'd see it ebb back in the fall. And this is just what the cycle was for the organization that I run. I don't know if it followed others. But what we're seeing now is the wait list is consistently and persistently at, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months out before anybody can even get assessed because of the lack of providers. So the things when we're looking at this systemically, the biggest issue is that there's huge carve-outs for mental health in insurance, and the reimbursement rates are so low that there's been a huge migration outside of community mental health, with people moving into private practice, and they're moving outside of networks. So the private practice providers are now at a point, even those who are in the very early stages of their career can charge upwards of $175, $200 per hour. And so the people who can afford to pay that out of pocket once a week, a couple times a month, they're able to get in and get seen. But the vast majority of working class people, when you're talking about an average of $200 for 1 hour of therapy a week, we can't afford that. And so that's where they're going through the insurance, but so much of the insurance reimbursables are reimbursing at rates of $70, $80, maybe $90 an hour, that for somebody who is a therapist and who has the student loans and the debt that it takes to become a mental health provider, they can't necessarily afford to work for that low of a reimbursement rate. So they're going again out of network, and the cycle continues to be problematic. So we're seeing that part as being, one of the biggest gaps. We're having a lot of trouble keeping people in community mental health because community mental health cannot pay at the same level that private practice can at this point in time. And particularly where we see people of color who have come historically from lower income families, they don't necessarily have the legacy of having financial resources to be able to afford to work at the lower rates that insurance is going to provide. It's also asking, historically negatively impacted communities to make a financial sacrifice. So one of the things that we often see in mental health is there's this underlying assumption that people of color are going to go into community mental health and do, work for less money because they're from the community. And, white practitioners are often, not always, but more likely to be.
We got about 2 minutes.
And the fact of the matter is, regardless of background, race, ethnicity, there's just not enough people coming into the field to be able to make up the need. We work with people with mild to moderate concerns. Like I said, it's depression, anxiety, trauma, stress, relationship issues. We do a lot of work with families that have histories of violence. We do a lot of work with, intimate partner abuse intervention, both with people who've been abusive as well as people who have experienced abuse. We work a lot with families that are involved in DCFS and working to maintain relationships with their children, keep their children in their households and such. So that's who we work with. We work from a culturally affirmative, trauma-informed lens. We also train new incoming therapists in
about 1 minute
clinical training program, where all of our services are provided by new emerging therapists who are working towards licensure, and that's how we're able to provide services on a sliding scale. So, our services slide down to zero, and, almost half of our services each year are provided for free.
That was Sierra Smith of Open Paths. Their website is www.openpaths.org. Once again, www.openpaths.org, and their client line is 310-258-9677. That's area code 310-258-9677. In related news, California plans to begin making its own insulin. The governor signed a $50 million contract with the nonprofit drug maker Civica. The cost of a vial of insulin would cost only $30 under this plan, as opposed to the current cost of $300.
KPFK Rebel Alliance News, Los Angeles.
The catastrophic floods in Pajaro, Monterey County, when a levee broke, have exposed the systemic racism and poor general conditions of farm workers in California. Steve Zeltzer interviewed Pamela Beth Sexton, a member of the Pajaro Valley Federation of Teachers Local 1936 and an adult education teacher. They discussed how the state refused to, that is to say, neglected to reinforce the levee, even though they were aware of the dangers.
My name is Pam Sexton, and I'm a teacher. I teach adult education in the Pajaro Valley Unified School District. I'm with Local 1936, Pajaro Valley Federation of Teachers, and I'm here at the Teachers Conference as a delegate. And I spent the last weekend, I spent both Saturday and Sunday at the Santa Cruz County Fairgrounds, where thousands of people are evacuated. Their houses are flooded. They told me stories of the water being up to their thighs, up to their waists. Kids, the evacuation order happened at midnight. And so families, and Pajaro is a small unincorporated community in North Monterey County. I live just south of it, and the community is mostly farm workers. We know that in California, like 80% of our farm workers are undocumented. These are my students. These are parents of students throughout our district, and they are folks, just to give you an impression of the community more, predominantly Spanish-speaking, but also lots of Mixteco, Zapoteca speakers, a lot of indigenous Oaxacans who are coming to the community even with limited Spanish. So it's a community that is marginalized by the structures of power and the systems of support. They're farm workers who already don't have paid medical leave. They already don't have sick leave. Basic, legal rights. And then this happens. Their possessions, they only left with what was on their back. And and children, in tow, living all together in a warehouse type space. So the need is great right now. I guess as a union member, as a human, I also want to say it's really critical to understand this as not just a disaster, not an environment, it's part of the systemic racial and economic injustice that has built this country, and that we need to radically shift. It's going to happen more with the climate crisis we're in, which is also happening because of the systemic racial and economic injustice in the country. And so I hope, I know that my local union has done a great deal to support racial justice, climate justice, economic justice, and now I was with other comrades in the shelters this past weekend, and I just appreciate the solidarity and hope it continues to grow.
And there was some issue about the levees, that they knew that there was a problem, but there wasn't any kind of urgency to make sure that this area would not be flooded. It's kind of like New Orleans.
That's
Poor
right.
Black communities get flooded. And
that's right, and that also has to do with systemic. So it wasn't just a few people who decided, but it's like actually written into policies that, because they're making economic calculations, well, who's going to be most effective, and we need to invest our money in these certain ways. So there's federal rules, there's state rules that work against the communities like Pájaro, and we need to change. Thank you for saying that, because that is a concrete example. When we just talk about, the system needs to change, like how do we change the system? We gotta identify these laws that are leading to this, because in January, just 2 months ago, we came this close, like on the levee. It was that close to breaking, and it was a hair's breadth.
nothing was done to make sure that...
Nothing was done. So
So they knew that...
Oh, they knew, for sure. And they were just saying, shoot, we dodged that bullet. And then, atmospheric river, and they're surprised, and it's really heartbreaking, and I think only by getting more people together to work more, just earnestly and demand change.
It sounds like an emergency situation for the working class, poor, particularly immigrant workers and communities.
In Pájaro, it's a disaster.
Well, we got about 4 minutes left on this one.
I don't know how long to recover from, because it's not just the displacement, homelessness, families, in some cases just without anything. There's that level of economic distress, but then there's also the flooding of all of these agricultural fields that are the livelihood of those farm workers, and the economic composition of they're what keep our county economy going. Our local industry, which needs to, green itself from the agricultural industry to a more sustainable system, but this is our local economy just shot. So it's a disaster on multiple levels, and then but this issue of equity and inequality. Some people. We were talking in this last workshop about climate issues, how when disasters happen, depending on what your current income is, you might actually gain some income because of relief funds. But in communities like Pájaro, they're the folks who statistically are going to lose and lose and not be able to gain back. And with that, I'll say that so I live in a beautiful community where there's so many grassroots organizations that have been organizing for decades, and they are working to support the Pajaro families,
It looks like we're going to bump right up against, if we play all the clips, it's going to bump right up against about 57 or 58. So when it comes down to the
fields,
to the calendar at the end, you know, just as you're looking at the clock, you'll know when to start rapping. You're going to be right up around 57, 58. And when you get 59, you're going to have to, you know, start thinking about closing.
That is working on obviously climate issues and heat stress, extreme heat days, and this flood all disproportionately impact our farm workers. I also volunteer with a group called the Watsonville Campesino Appreciation Caravan, and we do mutual aid, direct aid, showing appreciation to the farm workers.
No, the calendar.
And messages with information and love, but also through.
Do you have any calendar events?
Money.
Because I don't have any.
Folks who have more to our farm workers who don't have access to a lot of these government programs.
Yeah. And what do you think about President Biden's opening up?
No, clip 12 is just straight music, but that's okay.
Climate crisis is creating a disaster situation, particularly for poor people, working class people.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at this is like 4 paragraphs.
You have a calendar? I don't have a calendar.
No, so just go ahead and do a straight read on your outro.
That we're in a climate.
And then I'll fill the rest of it till the next show.
Immediately shift our lifestyles, our fuel,
It's like the oil companies control the government. I mean, the oil and fossil fuel codes that's their drive.
That's right.
No, that's like the secret police and stuff. Oh, right. No, that's the. But I don't think.
Can you hear the drumming? There's a revolution coming.
The secret police is something else. John Mearsheimer, distinguished professor of political science at the University of Chicago, gave a recent speech assessing the cause of the present Ukraine crisis, the best way to end it, and its consequences for all of the main actors. He has been described as the most influential realist of his generation.
Conventional wisdom is that Putin is the main cause of the crisis. Some say he's either crazy or irrational. Angela Merkel was making this argument for a while. He's bent on creating a greater Russia, and he bears marked resemblance to Adolf Hitler. I'll say a few words about each of these. I know a great deal about Adolf Hitler. I've written and I teach extensively on Nazi Germany's behavior in the 30s and during World War II. The idea that he bears any resemblance to Adolf Hitler is laughable in the extreme. It's hard to believe that serious people make that argument. The idea that he's bent on creating a greater Russia, I think if he could do it, he'd do it. He can't do it. Russia's a declining great power. And as I said to you before, if they were to try and create a greater Russia by invading Ukraine and by invading the Baltic states, they'd be jumping into the briar patch. I think Putin is much too smart for that, and he is in the process of wrecking Ukraine. I want to make that clear. And he's wrecking Ukraine because he's basically saying to the West, you can't have it, and I'll wreck it before you take it. Is he crazy or irrational? I don't think so. I think he's very strategic, and I don't think he's the main cause of the crisis, as I said to you. Another set of arguments associated with the conventional wisdom. This is that the United States is a benign hegemon seeking to promote European stability, seeking to promote stability in Asia, all over the globe, and so forth and so on. There are some countries like Japan and Germany, for sure, Poland, who view the United States as a benign hegemon. There are many countries out there who do not. Iran is one, China is another, and Russia is a third. They just don't see it that way. And because they don't see it that way, you should understand that when you take measures, you meaning the United States, that you think are going to be interpreted as benign, the other side will not see them that way. They will see them as threatening. And if you don't recognize what other people think, you're incapable of putting yourself in their shoes, you're going to get yourself into a heck of a lot of trouble. There is no evidence that we thought Putin was aggressive before the crisis. There's no evidence that we thought that. There's no evidence that we were talking about expanding NATO because we had to contain the Russians. Because again, NATO expansion was driven by 21st century men and women. They believe balance of power politics is dead. That's what happened here. Do you understand? Putin is a 19th century man. Right? He does view the world of balance of power in terms of balance of power politics, as do we when it comes to the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. And we thought that we could just drive right up to his doorstep and it wouldn't matter. We did not think that Russia was aggressive. What happened here is that after the crisis broke out on February 22nd, we then decided that Russia was aggressive. We then decided that Russia was bent on creating a greater Russia. It was after the fact. And by the way, this is why virtually all of Washington was caught with their pants down when this crisis broke out after February 22nd, because they did not see it coming. Talk a little bit about our response. We're basically doubling down. We're getting tougher and tougher with the Russians. That's our strategy. And that's exactly what you'd expect if you're going to blame them, given that we're incapable of blaming ourselves because we never do anything wrong. You all know that. All the problems in the world are caused by everybody else, never by the United States, because we're a benign hegemon. Well, if we're the good guys and they're the bad guys and they're misbehaving, they're bent on creating a greater Russia, oh my God, this is the 1930s all over again. Any sort of concession to Putin is Munich, October 1938. Can't do that. So what you do is you double down. You get tougher and tougher. Then this brings us to the question of whether we can succeed or not. My argument is you're playing a losing hand. And the reason you're playing a losing hand is because this is a competition between economic considerations and security considerations. The basic mindset of people in the West is that you can punish the Russians economically and they'll throw their hands up. My argument is when security considerations are at stake, when core strategic interests are at stake, and there's no question, ladies and gentlemen, in Russia's case, this is a core strategic interest, countries will suffer enormously before they throw their hands up. Right? So you can inflict a lot of pain on the Russians, and they're not going to quit. And they're not going to quit because Ukraine matters to them. And by the way, Ukraine doesn't matter to us. You understand there's nobody calling for us to fight in Ukraine. So in terms of the balance of resolve, it's all on their side. And I showed you that slide up there that depicted how much economic leverage the Russians have because of all that natural gas going westward. So we're playing a losing hand here. But let's assume that I'm wrong. Let's assume that we're playing a winning hand and that we are capable of backing Putin into a corner. And we're getting close to pushing him off a cliff. Is this good? You're talking about a country that's got thousands of nuclear weapons. The only circumstance, really, under which states use nuclear weapons is when they're desperate, when they think their survival is at stake. So what you're talking about is putting Putin in a situation where he's desperate. And if you go home and Google Putin and nuclear brinksmanship, you'll be reading all the articles that come up for the next 2 years. Because he's making it clear that you're fooling around with his core strategic interests. And again, he's got thousands of nuclear weapons. So you're putting yourself in a position where you're willing to risk a possible nuclear war over a piece of real estate, Ukraine, that is not of vital strategic interest to the United States. Again, it's not of vital strategic interest to us. By the way, and this will be my final point on this, what's truly amazing about all of this is that we were talking about incorporating Ukraine into NATO when we have now acknowledged by not taking military action over Ukraine that it's not a vital strategic interest. You understand that when you incorporate Ukraine into NATO, you're giving them an Article 5 guarantee, which says you'll come to their defense if they're attacked. You only give Article 5 guarantees to countries that are of vital strategic interest, like Germany during the Cold War. What were we doing? Thinking about giving an Article 5 guarantee to a country that's not a vital...
About 30 seconds.
Shows you how discombobulated American foreign policy is these days. And of course, the Ukraine crisis is just one of many messes that we've made. As you know, we have the Midas touch in reverse. There's nothing that we do that doesn't go south. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine, I could go on. So the point I'm making to you is, I do not think that this is going to work, but if it does work, I'm not sure it's a good thing.
KPFK Rebel Alliance News, Los Angeles.
Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping began meetings today, expected to extend through Wednesday, in what has been declared by some as one of the most important meetings of the decade. Political analysts Alexander Christenforou and Alexander Mukuris of the Duma discussed the recent political power shifts within China and the forming bond between Russia and China as the U.S. pivots to a conflict with China.
The two leaders will discuss energy, security cooperation. I'm sure they're going to discuss Ukraine. I'm sure they're going to discuss the escalation in Taiwan. I'm sure they're going to discuss the Middle East and everything going on there. Assad meeting with Erdogan, the recent negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. BRICS, they're going to talk about BRICS and AUKUS, all of these security military organizations, the Quad, AUKUS, that the Collective West, that the U.S. has put in place in the Pacific, very much like what NATO is to Russia.
Now, Xi Jinping has just been confirmed for a third term as Chinese president, and that's unprecedented in modern Chinese history. It makes Xi Jinping the longest serving leader, I think, since Mao Zedong, and it puts him in the same sort of position in terms of authority as, you know, people like, say, Deng Xiaoping used to have. So he's now clearly the most powerful man in China. I mean, we're no longer in a sort of collective leadership situation. He's also, just before he leaves for Moscow, carried out a very, very interesting and important reorganization of the central institutions of the Chinese government and of the Chinese Communist Party. It seems to me that what Xi Jinping is doing, is he's centralizing, especially a financial policy and all sorts of other types of policy as well. He's bringing them more under the control of the central government and of the central institutions of China, which ultimately means himself and people who are directly answerable to him. There's also been significant reshuffles in the Chinese government. So we've got a new prime minister, we've got a new foreign minister, a very hawkish foreign minister, by the way, at least one who's given a very powerful press conference, very critical of the United States. We've got a new defense minister who has a long history of very close cooperation with the Russians and who is therefore on a US sanctions list. We also have a new economic plan with China now opening up, obviously, putting lockdowns behind it, moving forward with its economy, aiming for at least 5% growth this year. And they've just made another big cash injection into the economy to spur it forward. We've had an increase in Chinese defense spending. They're budgeting for a 7% increase in defense spending, which is higher than GDP growth. And of course, we've seen a whole string of Chinese diplomatic initiatives. We've seen China brokering the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We've seen China engaged diplomatically on multiple fronts. And of course, we've also seen the Chinese publish a whole series of position papers following Wang Yi's visit to Munich, to the Munich Security Conference, and then his visits to Moscow. And we've had Chinese position papers of which by far the most important, is a very, very critical one about US foreign policy, which refers to US hegemony and criticizes US hegemony and US hegemonic policies. So all of this has happened over the very short period of time, and now we have Xi Jinping traveling to Moscow. The first trip he is making since he was confirmed for a third term as Chinese president. So this is obviously an extremely important visit from the Chinese point of view. Now, if you take all of these things together, it becomes very clear to me what this trip is all about from a Chinese point of view. They're going to Moscow. They're securing their friendship with the Russians. They're going to be looking at a whole swathe of agreements. But all of these steps that the Chinese are taking, including this trip to Moscow, is China preparing for a future confrontation with the United States. That's clearly now where all this is going. And that is why Xi Jinping is not just going to Moscow so that China knows confidently that Russia is there at its back, that the Russians will provide China with the food and energy it needs in the event that there's a clash with the United States and the US tries to impose a blockade. And of course the Chinese will be seeking Russian technology, for example in submarines and hypersonic missiles and maybe other things. And the Russians, of course, will be wanting guarantees from the Chinese that China is a big market for them. It's a big export market. It's also a source of investment and, of course, possible technology transfer as well.
Okay, what role does Australia play in all of this?
The Russians have some very useful technologies that the Chinese would be interested in. So the Russians have cruise missiles, subsonic cruise missiles, at least as good, perhaps superior to the Tomahawks. The Russians are amongst the world leaders in submarine technology. Some people think that they are the world leaders. And the Russians are, of course, the world leaders in hypersonic missile technology. So, given that we're looking at a submarine race, given that we're looking at a missile race, you can easily see why the Chinese would be very interested in these Russian technologies. What we're looking at is a naval arms race, which the Chinese are going to win.
The word is from the Kremlin that Putin and Xi are going to sign a declaration on entering, and I quote, a new era of relations.
I don't know that the Chinese are going to Moscow with a plan to supply Russia with weapons. I don't know that the Russians are asking the Chinese for any weapons. I haven't seen any evidence of this at all.
And the countries in the Pacific that are going to be used to contain China, we're looking at Australia, Japan, Philippines.
I gather that in the Philippines many people have doubts about this. Of course, there's Japan as well. Now, Japan probably is committed to this enterprise because of its own historic concerns about China. But of course, if Japan is built up, then South Korea might not be so happy. Other countries in the Pacific, Malaysia, Indonesia, they're probably nowhere near as keen about getting drawn into this. And the Chinese have great influence in these countries, and of course Vietnam too. This is their region. They've been there for thousands of years, and they've also got the enormous confidence that behind them they have a far bigger industrial capacity than the United States. China's big weakness in this confrontation has always been that it relies heavily on external sources for key raw materials and food, oil, gas, food. And the Russians can provide these, and they're able to do so bypassing those routes which the US could notionally blockade. So from a Chinese point of view, you can see why Russia is as important as it is. It doesn't just help China in terms of technology. It isn't just important for China in that the friendship with Russia helps to extend Chinese reach throughout Eurasia. It also helps China because it provides the Chinese with all these resources that China simply can't do without. And the Russians can do it, and they know that very well, obviously, and that's the basis of the relationship between the two. Just add up those three countries, the US, Britain, and Australia. Britain is far away. Australia? What does it add to US power overall? I mean, it's a small, it's 25 million people. I mean, and, you know, they're going to be taking on this location.
You know, you militarize it and you get the location. Yeah.
The Western powers can't win because the industrial resources available to the other side are so much greater.
For KPFK, Rebel Alliance News, here are today's international highlights with a special focus on non-NATO media. Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Moscow for a 3-day visit with his Russian counterpart. RT correspondent Shay Boats discussed the importance of the visit with Rachel Blevins.
It's very hard to overstate the importance of this visit by Xi Jinping to Moscow. And as part of this, the lead up to the visit, President Xi Jinping and President Putin have both written articles in the corresponding papers in each other's countries. And in his article, he has sort of outlined some of the key points which he's going to try and pursue through these meetings. He talks about the long history between Russia and China, shared almost moral values between the two states, that they're going to try to build not only infrastructural links, but also economic links, and build upon the ancient history as they warm together, in a sort of almost natural, partnership, which has evolved due to some of the pressure coming from the West.
It's not just Russia and China. There are a number of countries that are stepping up, that are increasing their ties with each other. What do you see is behind those changes when it comes to this overall multipolar world landscape here?
I think China, of course, is a leviathan when it comes to the economic world. It has a bigger manufacturing capability than the rest of the globe combined. So it's very difficult for the West to put pressure on China in an economic fashion because it could cause serious damage to their own economy. We've seen similar pressures on Russia failing essentially to deliver the outcome that they believe. So I think other countries in Africa, in the Middle East, are starting to look towards Russia and China to lead them to a brighter future, which isn't based on a dominant dollar or a sort of a rules-based order where the United States, makes the rules and gives the orders.
A pro-Syria sit-in has been held in Rome and in a number of capitals across the world as part of a campaign called End the Siege. Max Chivili has the details.
On Saturday, sit-ins were held in several countries across the world as part of a campaign aimed at denouncing the devastating effects of the sanctions imposed by the US and the European Union on Syria. The initiative, named End the Siege, has been joined by organizations based in a dozen countries, including Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, the UK, Germany and Canada. Italy's sit-in was held in Rome in front of the Colosseum, where members of the No War Network and the US Citizens for Peace and Justice denounced how US and EU sanctions have devastated Syria's economy and led to immense human suffering.
Syria is greatly suffering the consequences of the criminal sanctions imposed by our governments, particularly after the earthquake that hit that country over a month ago. Frustration about being excluded from assistance is growing, and I believe it is a scandal that the EU can't act independently, but it has to always submit to the US diktat.
Demonstrators at the sit-in said that the US must leave Syria and stop profiting from Syrian oil and wheat that has exacerbated the poverty in the country. Italy and Syria once maintained a robust relationship, but in 2012, 1 year after the Syrian conflict, Rome joined its Western allies in closing its embassy in Damascus. 7 years later, in 2019, when Italy had an anti-establishment government under the leadership of the Five Star Movement and the Northern League, it appeared that Rome was mulling over normalizing relations with Damascus and reopening its embassy there. However, something went wrong.
It happened that the then government was under enormous pressure, particularly by the United States.
Everybody knows that Italy is a country with limited sovereignty. Washington demanded Rome to stop liaising with Damascus the same way it has forced Italy to join the war in Ukraine. 1/3 of Syria is today occupied by American soldiers, and the US's thefts of Syrian oil, natural gas, and other mineral resources have led to energy shortages.
We're here today because this is the 20th anniversary of the invasion and occupation of Iraq by United States troops. They still have NATO contingent. 1,000 Italian troops are leading the contingent to rob the oil from northeast Iraq, impoverish the Iraqis, and send the oil to Turkey, Israel, and clients of the United States.
The February 6th earthquake has further worsened the already deteriorating economy and humanitarian situation in Syria. According to UN sources, even before the earthquake tragedy, 70% of the population needed humanitarian assistance due to the war in the country and the US-EU sanctions.
Documents from the Pentagon dating several years back reveal the U.S. long-standing policy of trying to influence Kiev's decision-making. RT's Donald Corder has more.
What does the Kiev regime have in common with Nicaraguan drug traffickers and Afghan Islamic fundamentalists? American money and expertise have converted all of them into proxies at one point or another. Take these 2019 job ads for U.S. State Department employees looking to advise Ukraine.
Okay, we're going to have to cut Paulina.
Capacity building, operational readiness. The advisor's
You notice how in between each of her little news clips she has a little music?
Systems toward
that next little music break, I'm going to fade her out.
We'll end it up. Okay.
Then I'm going to punch up that calendar music.
Defense establishment to move toward Euro-Atlantic integration. The Senior Strategic Policy Advisor will consult with the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration and their national security team on furthering Government of Ukraine-wide relations with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
When it comes to American string pulling in Kiev, these documents are just the tip of the iceberg. Up until February last year, the U.S.
Okay, just kind of stand by and listen for that little music.
They took a direct role in training neo-Nazi battalions like Azov on how to effectively use weapons supplied by Washington for the Ukrainian military. There are the open admissions that the U.S. helped coordinate last year's counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region and is planning to do the same in the spring of this year.
This contact group has made it clear.
Because she's still got about 4 minutes left and we're already at 57.
Over the long haul. Okay, and help Ukraine hold and advance during the spring.
Sounds good.
It's no wonder why Vladimir Putin, although he has repeatedly called for negotiations in the Ukraine conflict, doesn't see much sense in speaking with Zelensky himself.
What's the point of meeting with Zelensky if he gave away his country to complete foreign control? The key issues of life in Ukraine are decided not in Kiev but in Washington, and partly in Berlin and Paris. So what is there to talk about?
With all that military assistance, training, and coordination, though, the U.S. government could potentially be complicit in alleged Ukrainian war crimes. After all, Russia has documented over 2,000...
I think it should be coming up here real soon.
Many of the perpetrators being current members of Kiev's political and military leadership. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to target civilian areas in Donbass, with the number of documented attacks rising by the day.
According to the Office of the Ombudsman of the Donetsk People's Republic, between January 1st and December 28th, 2022, 1,091 civilians were killed in the region and another 3,533 people were wounded.
Human rights abuses, mounting civilian casualties, and a blank check for military assistance. All in the name of having Ukrainian proxies die for NATO's war, with the U.S. taxpayer footing the bill.
Well, you've been listening to the KPFK Rebel Alliance News. This is where you can hear news you cannot hear anywhere else because we are financially dependent only on you, our listener. Yes, we're a listener-sponsored station. You can go to kpfk.org to donate to this listener-sponsored station. Thanks so much for listening to the Rebel Alliance News. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. Thanks to our engineer, Wendell Handy, and all Rebel Alliance News contributors like Polina Valiliv, Steve Zetzler, and Bill Benton. Who else do we have? That's about any other people I didn't mention. We thank you, too. And, of course, you, our listening audience. Coming up next is IMRU. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you will join us again tomorrow at 6 p.m. Have a fine evening.
KPFK, Los Angeles.
Then you're gay, don't pretend that you're straight. You could be who you are any day of the week. You are unlike the others, so strong and unique. We're all with you.
If you're straight, well that's great. You can help procreate and make gay little babies for the whole human race. Make a world we can live in where the one who you love's not an issue. 'Cause we're all somewhere in the middle. We're all just looking for love to change the world. And we're all here in it together. We're one step closer to breaking down the walls.
Thanks for tuning in, and welcome to IMRU Radio Magazine, the world's longest-running lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender radio show, out front and out loud since 1974. I'm Michael Taylor Gray. Tonight, as we continue our journey through Women's History Month, Steve talks to the director of the 2017 film Girls Lost. And in honor of Cesar Chavez Day, March 31st, we have two Gaytina reports with women who continue his legacy. But first, our own Abby Dees gets a mammogram.
I'm way overdue for my mammogram. It's been about 6 years since I had one. And of course, the more time that goes by, the more I get nervous about getting a mammogram, afraid of what it might show. This